This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Rattan Lal, K-State's Roscoe Ellis Jr. lecturer, as he discusses sustainable agriculture and how soil management impacts food and climate security. K-State Farming Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti continues the show as he reminds corn growers about the importance of soil temperature for planting and emergence. Rebecca McMahon, Extension Local Food Systems Program Administrator, finishes the show as she covers the basics for selecting fruit tree varieties, such as apples, pears, peaches, cherries, and plums. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show with the Roscoe Ellis Jr. Lecturer in Soil Science here at Kansas State University, Rattan Lal. Rattan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
To start off our conversation, can you first just tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm Professor of Soil Science at Ohio State. I've been teaching there for about 37 years. And before that, I was at the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture. It's based in Ibadan, Nigeria. I was there for about 20 years, evaluating the impact of deforestation, tropical deforestation, on climate and hydrology, energy balance, and on food security. And I'm a graduate from Ohio State, and been between Nigeria and coming back to Ohio. I was also at the University of Sydney in Australia, where I worked as a senior research fellow on sustainable management of what we call vertisoil. These are clay soils of New South Wales. So I'm very pleased to be here today because I have some very high regard for excellent work which is done at KSU.
We're excited to have you here at Kansas State University and talking about the lecture you are going to give. It's titled Sustainable Agriculture and Soil Management for Climate and Food Security. And as you're talking about this, how are you defining sustainable agriculture?
Let's take the case of climate change. Many people believe that agriculture is a problem, and agriculture is also a problem in reducing biodiversity. Agriculture is also a problem in mitigating water quality issues and creating water pollution and so forth. Those of us who like to enjoy food, and I like to eat at least 3 times a day, we have a responsibility to make agriculture a solution. And that's where the word sustainable comes. How to make agriculture a solution to environmental issue of the 21st century. Climate change, water quality, biodiversity, and of course the sustainable development goals. You cannot achieve those things without a good quality agriculture. And that's what sustainability is. Sustainable agriculture means producing nutritious, healthy, and safe food while at the same time restoring the environment. And that's sustainability.
And as we're thinking about sustainable agriculture, also you're talking on soil management, something important for climate and food security?
Absolutely. Soil has been a source of greenhouse gases. Agriculture as a profession has been a source of greenhouse gases since the beginning of agriculture 10,000 years ago. Fossil fuel came into the picture about 1800 and so forth, 1715 to begin with, about 1800 more appropriately. But agriculture thus far, land use conversion from natural system to agriculture, has emitted almost 600 gigaton of carbon into the atmosphere. If you take the fossil fuel, since 1750, it has emitted about 450 gigaton. So if agriculture carbon emitted from the land-based sink can be put back, even half of it, and at the same time we find alternative to fossil fuel, keeping temperature warming below 2 degrees centigrade is still possible. That is why the title of my seminar, Sustainable Agriculture and Soil Management as a Solution to Climate and Food Security.
And something not only important for the United States.
Well, it is globally important, and United States being second largest emitter of fossil fuel and probably one of the highest per capita emitter, how to make agriculture a solution is equally important to the U.S. as it is globally.
What are a few thoughts that you have for making agriculture a solution?
Well, many practices which are very relevant, and we call them regenerative agriculture practices. And the word regenerative, like sustainability term, which is used quite often, are very synonymous. And it's a concept, how can soil be restored in its quality and functions while it is being used to produce food. And that's regenerative concept. So conservation agriculture, no-till farming, reducing tillage, leaving the crop residue back on the land, and following 4 principles of ecology. 4 principles of ecology are written in a book called The Closing Circle by Barry Commoner. And this book has 4 chapters. Everything is connected to everything else. Mother Nature knows no mercy. There is no such thing as a free lunch. And everything has a price. And it is very important to remember those principles, that you cannot take away from soil all the time. You must put it back whatever you take. And we call that as a law of return. So these are some of the basic concepts in agriculture. And one more thing that I should mention, soil is like a bank account. You can never withdraw from a bank more than what you put into it. Soil is the same way. The moment you try to take out of soil more than what you put into it, you degrade its quality and function. Eventually it becomes so bad that soil becomes not responsive to input. And this is where it is very important to remember that the people are mirror image of the soil they live on. When people are suffering and miserable, they pass on their sufferings to the land, and the land reciprocates. To break this vicious cycle, it's very important that people respect soil, so soil can respect back.
And as we're thinking about soil, is carbon cycling something that maybe people should have on their mind?
Absolutely. Because soil has such a large reservoir of carbon, 2,500 gigaton, billion ton, 9 zeros, to 1 meter depth, both organic and inorganic. Compare that with all the trees and woodland and forest and grasses of the world, 620 gigaton. So 2,500 versus 600 to 1 meter depth. If you take to 3 meter depth, soil has much higher, 6,000 gigaton of carbon, both organic and inorganic. So when the carbon cycling is disrupted by human activities, then the carbon in the soil can be emitted back in the atmosphere, either as CO2, carbon dioxide, or as a methane gas. And methane gas is 21 times more potent in causing global warming. So the carbon cycle disruption means carbon being taken out of soil and not put it back. And carbon restoration or sequestration or recarbonization means putting carbon back. That goes back to the farming practices. Not taking away the crop residue, not taking away the animal waste, recycling it back, growing cover crop in off-season, not putting fertilizer and pesticide more than what is absolutely necessary, making sure water balance is maintained, and making sure, as you said, carbon cycling, that carbon is being cycled in coupling with, jointly, with nitrogen, with water, with phosphorus, with sulfur. And that decoupling is essential for sustainable agriculture. Decoupling makes agriculture unsustainable. And that is exactly what has been happening, that we have now almost 30 to 40% of ice-free land everywhere in the world degraded. We can't afford it.
As we look forward then for our producers and are talking to people in agriculture, what are a few key points that you really want to hit home with them around this subject?
Well, carbon farming. What it means is growing carbon in soil and land, trees as well as soil, wetlands, degraded lands, mine land, so that it's a commodity. Just like corn is a commodity, just like cotton is a commodity, or soybean is a commodity, farmer can get income out of it. So growing carbon in soil so farmer can get income out of it. That way farmers have something to look forward to, that I'm not sacrificing, I'm also at the same time getting something. The question is, how much carbon price can farmer expect? So in that term, there's a unit called carbon credit. 1 carbon credit is 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. So there are many companies coming up these days on the trade carbon credit. They talk to farmers, we will buy carbon from you at a certain price. The question is what price? And the price should be determined either by market, demand and supply, or the price can also be determined by evaluating the societal value of carbon. If you put carbon in soil, what are the societal gain? What does society get out of it? What does consumer get out of it? Climate change, water quality, water renewability, biodiversity, the aesthetic value, the cultural value. If you put all of those together, the cost of one credit is $50. If we do that, if we can implement that, and if we can have our policymaker implement Soil Health Act in the next Farm Bill, where farmers are rewarded, the future of climate change is in our hand. And I'm hoping that Soil Health Act, if it materializes, it should be very timely. And the reason I keep on mentioning that, we have a Clean Air Act, EPA, 1967. We have Clean Water Act, EPA, 1971. It is not possible to have clean air and clean water if we do not have a healthy soil. It's a time to have a Healthy Soil Act. And the Healthy Soil Act is not supposed to punish anybody. It should reward farmers who do better agriculture and sustain soil in a way that it becomes a solution.
Is there a way people could get a hold of you if they have more questions?
I am director of the center at Ohio State. I'll be delighted to answer anybody's question or provide written information. We have some fact sheets, how to manage soil, how to manage agriculture crop, how to make agriculture a solution. It is something very important these days in the discussions.
That was the Roscoe Ellis Jr. lecturer in soil science here at K-State, Rattan Lal. I will put a link in today's show notes where you can find the contact information for Rattan. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Thursday show talking about soil considerations for planting corn. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Farming Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti. Ignacio, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelley, for your time.
Ignacio, as we're thinking about planting corn or planting really any row crops, what do producers need to keep in mind?
Well, I would say there are a couple factors. I mean, when you're thinking about planting corn specifically, one of the key factors at this time of the season is basically the minimum soil temperature. And if you look at it specifically for corn, minimum temperature for germination and early growth, we usually are saying around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And we need to mention this, that when the soils are below 50 degrees, we might have still explore some potential problems on the germination. So might have some tissue problems on that plant that is just going through the early stages of, exerting the roots and trying just to emerge from the ground. So if we are in very cold temperatures, the advice in many situations is hold it, don't plant, and also look at the forecast. And we will discuss on this, but the forecast on temperatures and the changes for the next coming 7 days are also critical. If you look at that period of the germination and the emergence, at this time of the year, it can take several couple days, and we need to be careful because once we are planting, even if we are planting under the right soil temperature conditions, we know that if there is a cold front coming on the next 2 or 3 or 4 days, we might see some potential impacts on that emergence. And unfortunately, because at this time of the year, the overall emergence might take sometimes between 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to see a potential impact on that low temperature very late in the season. And then we might need to then start looking at stand counts, looking at how many number of effective plants we have in the field, and from there decide if you are ready to replant. And we know that we don't want to get to that point. Seed cost is one of the largest costs when you're looking at corn inputs, and we really are trying to minimize basically going to that problem that we have issues on number of plants. And the second aspect that we can discuss when you're thinking about temperature issues is about the uniformity. If you think about one crop that is really truly affected about plant uniformity, that crop is basically corn. If we have not really good spacing, and if we don't have spacing between plants, it's not uniform, or even the situation not only just in between plants, but also temporal lack of uniformity. When we have plants that were coming up 2 weeks after planting, and then there were some set of plants that were coming up 3 or 4 weeks after, that difference in emergence, in time to emergence, it also creates a problem for those plants that are coming behind, that those plants that are coming behind, they finish to be kind of not really acting as an entire, basically, cornfield, but basically those are plants that they might be behind for the entire growing season, and they might be reaching flowering late in the season. And sometimes we are walking at the end of the season and we see plants that they never got to form, like ears and kernels. And all of these that we are describing, sometimes it's just a consequence of a really bad stand and plantation. And then soil temperature clearly plays a critical role in corn.
And as we're thinking about that soil temperature, it's impacted by more than just the temperature we feel outside.
Yeah, we need to always think about basically the soil temperature, and not just the air temperature. This is the distinction between the two. Soil temperature is also, we usually tend to report, if you look at our e-updates from previous week, if you look at the ones that we are reporting, the low temperatures that we experienced during this week, we usually tend to focus on the first 2 inches of the topsoil. And we are always saying if the soil is under dry conditions, if we have not enough water, there is more fluctuation of those temperatures. So when the air temperature drops, that soil can drop very fast. Because it doesn't have any kind of a buffer power in terms of basically mitigating changes. And then take to basically mimic very similarly or in some fashion the changes on the air. When we have soil conditions that we have more moisture, then we have a little bit of a buffer effect, and usually that soil temperature is not following that closely to the air temperature. So that's why an important aspect is we are looking at soil temperature, and in order to be safe and in order to say, okay, we are really looking for a good uniformity and synchrony in emergence, we are saying that when that soil temperature at, like saying 2 inch is consistently above 55 degrees, we really feel better in terms of, basically planting corn.
As we are talking about soil temperature, Ignacio, what have we currently been seeing when it comes to that?
Well, if you look at, for example, this last week, we have experienced, I would say, low temperatures in general. And it's a good reminder that we are still in March. And I know that it's tempting for many farmers out there that they are thinking about this idea of, we are ready to go. Weather looks good. Moisture-wise, in many places, we might be okay. And they look at just a warm day in March and they think, okay, I should probably get the planter and get it out tomorrow. And if you look at these last 7 days on basically average soil temperature, we have some places, that we drop in many places, depending on the location. In Kansas, we go from all the way from 45 degrees in Northeast. Some places that we just go to closer to 40s. And then we have some places that probably the maximum that we have in many places is around 55. But that is more South Central. In many situations in the northern part of the state, Northeast, North Central, Northwest, many of these environments we are getting always around closer to less than 45 degrees. And this is just something that is a kind of a cause for concern. And it's something to remind us, looking at the weather forecast, these temperatures are not optimal for planting corn. It's not that the corn is not coming up, it's that we are increasing the probability of failure on emergence. And then that's one of the big things that we discussed in many situations. And as I mentioned before, some of the wet soils, they are expected to warm up slower. So we will see that difference compared to the dry soils. So they basically will fluctuate more rapidly. And that will be something that if you look at the precipitation forecast for the next 6 to 10 days, we are kind of in the near normal. And if you look at the outlook of temperature, in many situations, if you look at that outlook, we are kind of below normal. And below normal is just not telling us too much, because below normal could be just a half degree or less below normal. But it's just to be on the safe side. The next 6 to 10 days temperature outlook is just showing us that we will be slightly below normal in terms of temperatures. So take a look to your forecast, when you're taking the decision for planting corn, and make sure that you check, those conditions.
For those corn growers who are ready to get out in the field, really, when is that optimal time for them to say, yep, let's put our tractors out there?
For me, it's always about this kind of a magical number of when I see that I see temperatures, soil temperatures, these 2-inch, that they are consistently above 55 degrees, and I see the forecast for the next 7 days, and I see basically no expectation of really low temperatures on the forecast, I will feel more comfortable to say, let's get things rolling.
And oftentimes, when is that for producers to go out in the field? Because they're really not behind schedule.
No, they're not behind the schedule. If you look at we presented on one of the last year updates, this kind of the last spring freeze. And of course, that last spring freeze changes by the state. So we have, if you look at Southeast, we usually have that the first week of April tend to be the last, between April 1st and 5th is kind of the average last spring freeze. But as you are moving like northwest, that is changing. And we tend to see, like if you go to central or if you even go beyond, you are sometimes in the middle of April. So we are April 12, 14, our average last spring freeze. And then if you go northwest, you will see that we are towards the end of April. And I think that it's important to understand this because that means that we have a probability that we could get impacted by freeze. And then we are not, at this moment, we are not even delayed. Most of the farmers, they just are slowly starting in some places in Kansas, and some of the guys are just making sure that everything is ready just to start.
Ignacio, what resource is there for growers who would like to check out what their soil temperature is?
There are multiple aspects. I will say the Mesonet. So if you go to our mesonet.kstate.edu, we have a really nice network of weather data and weather stations across the state. And I think that they can check there basically difference in temperature, precipitation. Some of this is basically I would say one of the main sources of information if you are thinking about getting some kind of a near real-time data that is useful for farmers. Getting data from Mesonet, if they go to the section of agriculture and they go to the soil temp for soil temperature, they will be able to retrieve all the information that they need in order to really look at the temperature to take those decisions.
That was K-State Farming Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti. I will link some resources in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Many fruit trees can be grown in Kansas, but it can be challenging. For the March K-State Garden Hour, Rebecca McMahon, Extension Local Food System Program Administrator, covered the basics for selecting fruit tree varieties, along with some of the challenges. For example, she says the apples that we see in the store won't grow well in Kansas.
And that gets really frustrating for most home gardeners because you're like, oh, but I really like Honeycrisp or I really like XYZ apple. And then the nursery sells it or the box store sells it. But those varieties tend to have really severe disease challenges in Kansas. And so we want to look for varieties that have resistance to apple scab, fire blight. Cedar apple rust is super critical here in Kansas, and powdery mildew. So you really want to, especially if you don't want to be spraying with a conventional fungicide on a consistent basis every season, you really want to look at these disease-resistant varieties rather than choosing, that variety that you're familiar with from the grocery store. Pears also typically require the cross-pollination, and pears can be really tricky to line up the pollination windows. So when you're looking for varieties, you can't just pick any old 2 pear varieties. You have to make sure that their bloom windows line up so that you get good pollination. Fire blight is also our number one problem, and so we want to look for fire blight resistance. Our peaches and nectarines, these guys are a nice switch. They are self-pollinating, so you only need one tree. And it's important to note that these trees are much more susceptible to stress compared to apples and pears. They don't live nearly as long, and you want to really carefully research hardiness and cold tolerance. I tend to encourage folks in Kansas to look for late blooming varieties because that's going to give you the best chance of getting a crop in a year when we have late frosts. There's so many things to think about in terms of peach varieties, whether they're clingstone or freestone, the flesh color, flat versus round, melting versus non-melting flesh, meaning how soft the flesh gets at maturity, acid levels. But what's most critical is our cold hardiness. So both winter hardiness, looking for a variety that's hardy to zone 5 or 6, depending on your location, and then that late bloom and frost tolerance on the buds, on the flower buds. Cherries, tart cherries and sweet cherries. Tart cherries tend to do pretty well in Kansas. They're naturally small trees, grow up to about 15 feet tall, and tend not to have as many disease or insect challenges as a lot of other fruits. Doesn't mean there aren't some, but they're not typically as problematic. Pretty cold hardy, pretty frost resistant, typically self-pollinating. But of course, most people want to grow sweet cherries, and sweet cherries are a little bit trickier. They do require cross-pollination, except for a few of our newer varieties, but they don't tolerate our weather extremes nearly as well. And most sweet cherries tend to have large trees that don't live very long. So they can be a challenge to grow in Kansas. The sweet cherries, black gold, Stella, and white gold all have some self-fertile characteristics or ability to self-pollinate, but that doesn't mean you're not going to still deal with cracking and other stress related to weather conditions. Last up is going to be plums, just kind of differentiating between Japanese and European types of plums. So Japanese types are typically what we're used to seeing in the grocery store that are juicier, sweet. European types are blue and are often the ones that we typically buy dehydrated as prunes, so not nearly as juicy in that regard. So, of course, the less likely we are to want to eat them, the more hardy they are for Kansas. It's pretty typical. So Japanese types are typically only hardy to zone 6, and they tend to bloom earlier and be more susceptible to those spring frosts compared to our European types. European types can also set some fruit without cross-pollination. And then, of course, we do have lots of American native species. There's not been a whole lot of selection or breeding work done on those. Growing up, we had a couple of just American plum species on our farm, and they had little plums that we would take and juice out and make jelly and all kinds of stuff like that.
That's Rebecca McMahon, Extension Local Food System Program Administrator, with information on selecting fruit trees for Kansas. To learn more, do an online search for K-State Garden Hour. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.